The story of George Washington. Every February 22nd, we remember the birthday of George Washington. We call him the father of our country. George Washington was born on a farm in Virginia in 1732. There is a story that young George chopped down a cherry tree. He said to his father, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down your cherry tree." George liked math and numbers. He became a surveyor. He measured farms and marked off roads. George also was a farmer. He had 5 farms. Each day he visited his farms. During the Revolutionary War, George was the leader of America's army. He won the war at Yorktown, Virginia. After the war, George and other men wrote the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution formed our country. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. His wife Martha was the first lady. George was a good president for 8 years. Then George said, "I'm tired. I want to go home." George and Martha went home to Mount Vernon. They lived there for the rest of their lives. To honor George Washington, the capital of the United States is named Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument is a tribute to him. His face is on our quarters and $1 bills. George Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington and the General's Dog. George Washington is one of America's greatest heroes. Most people know that George was honest and brave, but there is something about George that people don't always know. George Washington loved animals. George learned to ride horses as a boy. Sometimes he rode into town. George rode fast, but he never fell. People said he was the best rider they had ever seen. When George grew up, he moved to a farm called Mount Vernon. Every day, George checked on the horses and hogs. He checked on the oxen, mules, and sheep. But he spent the most time with his dogs. George had a lot of dogs. He owned 36 dogs in his lifetime. He took them hunting. He played with them. He even gave them cute names like Mopsy, Sweet Lips, and True Love. Sometimes George spoiled his dogs. He let them run around the house. One day, George's wife Martha cooked a ham for dinner. George's dog Vulcan jumped up and stole the ham right off the table. Martha chased after him, but George just laughed. George liked being at Mount Vernon with Martha and the animals, but America needed him. America was not yet its own country. It was an English colony. That means it belonged to England. Many American colonists wanted to be free from England, so they went to war. The war was called the American Revolution. The colonists chose George to be their general. George chose his favorite dog, Sweet Lips, to go with him. He said goodbye to Martha and Mount Vernon. He jumped on his horse Nelson. Then he rode into battle. Sweet Lips was right beside him. In George's day, soldiers often brought dogs with them to war. Dogs helped hunt. Dogs helped track the way. Dogs helped guard against wild animals. Best of all, dogs were great partners. The general of the English army was named William Howe. He had a dog too. He also had 9,000 soldiers. They had plenty of supplies. George did not have nearly as many supplies. Sometimes his soldiers were cold. Sometimes they were hungry, but they did not give up. In the fall of 1777, George's troops went to Pennsylvania. They were fighting the English troops. Guns fired, rat-a-tat-tat. Cannons roared, boom, bang, and smoke filled the air. Finally, the fighting ended. The English soldiers went back to their camp. The battle was over for the day. The smoke began to clear. George noticed a dog without a soldier. It looked lost. George bent down and patted the dog's head. The dog followed George back to the colonist camp. He wagged his tail. "Whose dog is this?" wondered George. George looked at the dog's collar. The tag had a man's name on it. That name was William Howe. William Howe? George couldn't believe his eyes. William Howe was the enemy. Word about the enemy's dog spread through camp. Some of George's men wanted to keep the dog, but George said no. George believed the dog belonged with his master. George had his friend Alexander Hamilton write a note to General Howe. The note said that George wanted to return the dog. Both sides raised white flags. The white flag means no one could fight. George's soldiers walked the dog across the battlefield. They gave him back to General Howe. People in England found out about George's good deed. The English still wanted to beat George and win the war, but now they respected him. Some English people even liked him. They had never heard a story of such great kindness between enemies. In 1783, America won the war against England. America became its very own country. Gorge Washington went home to Mount Vernon. Friends around the world wanted to honor George. They wondered what he would like. Then they remembered the story about the dog. Soon, presents started arriving at Mount Vernon. The King of Spain sent George a mule. George named him Royal Gift. A friend from France gave George an even bigger gift: 7 dogs. George's work was not done, though. The American people needed a leader. They elected George to be their first president. People all over America loved their new president. They cheered when he rode by in his carriage. They knew it was him because his 6 white horses always led the way. Gorge Washington, our first president. It was a cold winter morning on February 22nd, 1732. This was more than 200 years ago. Inside a Virginia farmhouse, where it was cozy and warm, a special baby boy was born. The baby's name was Gorge Washington. As little George grew up, he loved the farm and all of the animals. He loved his horse best of all. George had 2 older brothers who lived away. He lived with a younger sister and 3 brothers. They followed George's every move. "Let's play follow the leader," said Betty. "George is the leader," said John. Samuel and Charles agreed. George went to a small country school. He worked very hard. He was one of the smartest students. George was also the most honest boy in school. He grew up very fast. He was bigger and taller than all of the other boys. Everyone looked up to George. Sometimes George would choose games for his classmates to play. "George is a natural-born leader," his schoolmaster would say. In school, George liked to read and write. He liked numbers, but he liked to make maps and measure land best of all. This is called surveying. George practiced by measuring the vegetable gardens on his farm. Many farmers wanted George to survey their land. It would help them know how much seed to buy when it was time to plant their crops. George was only a boy of 16, but the farmers trusted him. They knew George was very smart and honest. "He will do a perfect job," one farmer said to another. George's big brother, Lawrence, took him on a surveying trip in the Virginia wilderness. They stayed many cold and rainy days and nights. There were many wild animals. George learned how to take care of himself in the woods. Living in the wilderness helped George to become an even greater leader. When he was only 20 years old, he became a major in the Virginia Army. In 1754, a war broke out. French settlers and Native Americans in the Ohio Valley would not let the English settlers have farms there. George Washington was called to help the English settlers. One day, George met a lovely lady named Martha Custis. She was a widow with 2 children. They fell in love and were married in 1759. George and Martha moved into a beautiful mansion in Mount Vernon, Virginia. They had many parties, laughter, and fun in their home. But Washington was soon called to war again. It was 1775. America was a very small country with only 13 colonies then. During this time, England ruled America. The rulers in England were mistreating America. They wanted America to pay unfair taxes. A war broke out. The Americans chose George Washington as their leader. The war lasted 8 years. George Washington was now a general. Through his leadership, the American colonies won the war. America was no longer ruled by England. The colonies became the United States of America. Americans were very happy, but the new little country needed a leader. Everyone in the land wanted one and only one man for this job, General George Washington. So they made him the first president of the United States of America on April 30th, 1789. On the day of his inauguration, President George Washington rode on a beautiful white horse on his way to the ceremony. Hooray! The people cheered when the president stood before them to give his speech. Some people cried with joy. President Washington was a great president. He traveled all over America to see what the country needed. He passed good laws to help Americans. George Washington was president for 8 years. Afterward, he went back to his home in Mount Vernon. He enjoyed good times and laughter again with Martha, his family, and friends. Americans will never forget the first president of their land. George Washington, America's first president. George Washington is often called the father of our country. He was the first president of the United States of America. Keep reading to learn about this important leader. George Washington was born on a farm in Virginia in 1732. Virginia was one of 13 colonies ruled by England at that time. America was not even a country yet. George rode his horse to school. He was good at math. He was not as good at spelling. When George was 16 years old, he left home to find work. Some people thought he was a grown-up because he was so tall. George got a job measuring land and making maps. George's dream was to become a soldier. When he was 20, he joined the Virginia Army. George was very brave. Soon, he was put in charge of many other soldiers. George also dreamed of having a family. He married a woman named Martha Custis. George left the army and became a farmer, but soon he had to return to the army. At that time, a war was starting because the colonies did not like England's rules. The colonies formed an army. George was chosen to lead it. George's army had problems. There were not enough uniforms and tents. The soldiers were not trained. Many of them were farmers. How could America win the war? George was a great leader. He trained his soldiers. He inspired them too. George ordered that the Declaration of Independence be read to the army. The soldiers all cheered. It said that the colonies were free from England. The war lasted 8 long years. There were many battles, but the colonies did not give up. The English finally asked for peace. George's army had won the war. The colonies became their own country. The United States of America, the new country, needed a leader. George was a hero, so he was elected to be the first president. Being president was a very hard job. There was a lot of work to be done. George traveled to different states. He learned about problems and tried to solve them. George could not run the country all by himself. He chose people to help him, such as Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. George was elected president 2 times. People even wanted him for a 3rd time, but George thought the country needed a new president. Finally, he returned to his home in Virginia. Today, there are many places named after George Washington. His face is also on the $1 bill and the quarter.
Choose what kind of video you want to see further and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss a new story.